And good evening. It is Patrick Lovell simultaneously simulcasting as Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con on my YouTube channel at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con. And also, I've been continuing this experiment with Twitter Spaces. Um, and tonight's episode is censorship, RFK Jr., Lawrence O'Donnell, and who is Russell Brand. It's interesting because over the last week, I've just, I, I guess, hit it out of the park with these Twitter Spaces, and that's really the whole point of everything I'm trying to achieve through social media is to make a connection. And I've had over 10,000 views on some prolific interviews, interactions with some folks, as well as some topics that I feel are very important to share. And boy, I'll tell you, they seem to be working. So I'm going to continue to try to pound the rock, as I say. I'm trying to go beast mode, like one of my favorite players in NFL history, Marshawn Lynch, against corruption. And I want to pound the rock of truth until I blast through in the secondary and just destroy the competition, because that's what I've got to do. I've got to be able to achieve this because there's so much noise. There is so much to get lost in. And, it depends on what platform, but each one has sort of different sort of variables of how we're supposed to interact. And it's amazing. I want to start off by saying that, last night I happened to observe, I make one comment about a specific topic, and you can immediately get a ton of reactions. And a lot of the times the reactions come through on sort of, these I don't know, these feeds that you can't keep track of what the comment was that created a comment, and so on and so forth. And so you lose context. But some people are extremely razzled, and angry and reactionary and judgmental and have absolutely zero idea what you are, who you are, where you're coming from, what you have to say, whether or not they'll be, ingratiated, willing to discuss, that sort of thing. But that's the whole point of what Twitter is designed to do, right? It's like, look, for the most part, unless you've got a blue check mark and you pay the monthly subscription fee, you've got what, 180 characters, and you're supposed to just react. And most people react in ways that are just absurd or extremely nauseating or incredibly offensive, and sad. But sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's fun to just mix it up. Like, for example, I find myself, I don't have a lot of followers on Twitter. In fact, prior to giving up on Facebook, I reached the maximum amount of people that could follow me. But what I had found on Facebook was that most of the interaction was like my friends that I've grown up different times of my life with, for example, that, are all trying to outdo each other with pictures of how beautiful their lives are. And it really became a place that wasn't appropriate for any sort of real conversation or dialogue. And I tried. God knows I tried. And I reached a lot of people that had found me one way or the other. But then after a while, I started observing that, I don't know, the more I ignored Facebook, the more I ignored Facebook, the more friend requests that I received. And it just got to be ridiculous. It was kind of like, think back to like junior high school, right? You try really hard to make some friends, and fortunately for me, I was very sociable back in the day, but I certainly remember the feeling of, chasing people to be friends and then winning them over. But, at times people would, not want to be your friend, and maybe they'd ignore you and to get more attention and all that social sort of hierarchy kind of stuff and whatever. I mean, social media is like that, in spades and manipulated depending on what the platform is. And so I grew bored of Facebook. I didn't find that I was, getting anywhere with it. I mean, Instagram, what would you want to post on Instagram unless you're beautiful or doing something really spectacular, or you have a beautiful family, and I love to share photos, and I had all of those. So, I was pretty active for a while, but TikTok. We did a TikTok feed for Patrick Level Truth Bombs the Con, and I never thought it break through. But I think at the time when we first started, which was about a year and a half ago, it was about the time where all I ever saw on TikTok were, you know, beautiful women dancing or lip syncing or pole dancing. I don't know what that says about me and my algorithm feed, but that's what I had initially, and I thought there's no way anybody's going to pay attention to what I have to say on TikTok. But one of my colleagues, my friend, a wonderful woman, a woman by the name of Becky Weesey, who is actually in our work at the con, and I'll always refer you to watch the con. Please do. I'm the producer and muckraker journalist of a 5-part docuseries that reveals the most important information really of the last 70 years, and it's available at www.thecon.tv. And hopefully through these series of Twitter spaces, many of you will be, determined that, it's time I've got to watch the con, particularly now that we're offering it for free. It's been out there for about a year and a half, and I'll circle back to, all of the things that make the con what it is, and why it's important to what we're talking about. But going back to TikTok, like I would literally, when we first started dropping truth bombs, the algorithm started picking up and we'd get like 50,000 views in a 24-hour period. I mean, just something crazy like that. Eventually, through all of our different hashtags and what we ended up doing, we ended up, reaching, I guess, 7.5 million views, but it never really translated to what it should or could have if people were really paying attention. And again, as I started to really, spend more time on TikTok, and I used to have to like do a stopwatch where I'm about to jump on TikTok, and I can only stay on for 5 minutes because it started giving me feeds of things that I really wanted to watch, not just beautiful women, but rock and roll and incredible action sports athletes and cool dogs and orcas and great white sharks and tiger shark, whatever. All of these things that I'm interested in, it definitely got me, right? And so I just, sometimes I'd spend a half hour watching TikTok and go, holy crap, what did I just do? But meanwhile, because we were putting all of these truth bombs out there and Becky was creating all of these little funky sort of animations that, accompanied it, we were getting huge numbers, absolutely huge numbers. And so we stuck with it for a long time. Like I said, we got about 7.5 million views, reached a lot of people, got a lot of comments, but it didn't move the needle in terms of what I was trying to achieve by creating millions of people to see the con, and 2, translate that to a populist movement to purge corruption. And so it became this kind of work in progress. So I went to YouTube, I started recording these videos, started growing. I think I've got, a pretty small, limited audience. I can't remember what the tech law that was signed during the Trump administration. I don't want to get off of my phone because I might stop recording, and I got a lot that I want to try to cover. But there was a demarcation time. I think it was probably 2017, 2018, something like that. Trump signed this law regarding technology and what Google could do and what all of the other tech companies could do. And I think, unfortunately, I can't remember the name at the moment. I've got this like mental block of this name for some reason. But the consequence of this action was that, if you had already had a legacy audience, you had already built tens of thousands of viewers, maybe you were a celebrity, maybe you had millions of people following you, the way that the algorithms were going to be managed was that those who had the most algorithms were going to win because they're going to be fed more and more, eyeballs and traffic, because Google makes money on traffic and eyeballs for advertisement, and that's how the code's written on YouTube. And so I know there was a huge demarcation. So, the long and the short of that was it became very difficult to penetrate eyeballs on YouTube. And I've learned more about how the structure of YouTube is supposed to function, but we haven't even gotten really close to, kind of like the baseline parameters to really start building the audience in a way that, will create the sort of audience where you can actually have impact in society. And so we're still working on it, but, lo and behold, I find Twitter Spaces, and maybe because it's new in the process, maybe just because some of my information is getting out to people, maybe I'm hashtagging the right things, but like I said, over the course of the last 2 weeks, over 10,000 views on a number of these, and I want to keep that going. Hopefully, in a monumental way, because ultimately, the information that I have is so monumentally bigger than everything we're in the midst of, and it's just absolutely insane and stupid. And I hope one day, and I bet long after I'm gone, long after I'm dead, after the end of the world, after all of the things of the future archaeologists and historians and everybody else start putting this stuff together, they'll probably start to find what it was that I put out there and go, oh my God, this guy had the answers that could literally save what ultimately blew up the world, but yet nobody was listening because it was too loud and because the algorithms were written to ultimately elevate lies, and that ultimately the big money found ways to be able to, in their world, use small investments to buy influence, to create platforms, and then ultimately own what we call mainstream television, mainstream media, radio, their personalities, everything else, and all of the power that comes with it. And they were able to elevate lies to the point that nobody could understand what was really going on. Everybody tried to murder each other, and the world blew up because they couldn't fix the problems that were at hand, because we turned into, a Armageddon of zombies that were feeding on lies and continue to do so. And so what's that have to do with the title of tonight's Truth Bomb / Twitter Space Live? Well, censorship, for one. Let's start there. So one of my heroes is a guy that I no longer consider a hero. I'm very curious who he is, all things considered, but I've certainly noticed a pattern of what he does and why he might do it and what it means in the context of ultimately censorship. And I think he's done some heroic work, and I think he makes some great points, but at the same time, in service to what is what I'm going to get at. And I'm speaking about Matt Taibbi. Now, Matt Taibbi, for those of you who only know Matt Taibbi from probably, the Twitter files forward and everything that he's been in the midst of in the last, 4 or 5 months, Matt Taibbi was once one of the most prolific journalists this country's ever produced. His father was a journalist. He's a fantastic writer himself. I had been a fan of his before the events that shaped up in the aftermath of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. But it was really the 2008 Great Financial Crisis that made me really, really appreciate Matt Taibbi and ultimately changed my life and set me on this adventure to become who I am and lead me to this Twitter Spaces and this YouTube Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con moment as I'm moving forward to try to elevate what, quite frankly, Matt Taibbi introduced to me. So in the time period 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, maybe all the way up to 2016, Matt Taibbi's, center of gravity was the absurdity of the corruption and the racketeering and the criminal elements of our financial sector. He used to write like 10,000 word essays in some of the most prolific revelations of all of the aforementioned in ways that, to me, at this stage of the game, they kind of feel like, when I was a teenager, I really, really fell in love with Led Zeppelin, even though I was definitely fond of Led Zeppelin when I was younger, when they were basically in their prime. But it wasn't until I was in my late teens, maybe early 20s, that I started listening to a lot of Led Zeppelin. And, when you look back at some of their albums and some of their songs, you can remember specific time periods where they did some of their most prolific work. And when I think about Matt Taibbi, I kind of have that correlation. Like he's just this great artist, this great impact on society, especially at that time. And, mostly, he's known for, which was one of his great pieces, The Great Vampire Squid, which is the story of Goldman Sachs. And they always stick their blood funnel into money, right? And he made really complex subjects very easy to understand. And his work was amazing. And I really started in earnest to reach out to Taibbi to be the face of this long form investigative series that I was going to produce. I wanted him to be the guy because he was the guy. And so, as it turned out, very small world esque, um, the guy who became my partner on this project, who gave us the opportunity to go around the country and figure out what we did to put in the con, ultimately went to school with Matt Taibbi's boss. And they were classmates in high school. And in fact, Matt Taibbi's boss was, quite frankly, at that time, intimidated by who became my partner. And Matt Taibbi's boss is a guy by the name of Will Dana. If you know anything in the world of journalism and editors and that sort of thing, you might recognize the name. He's incredible. I think he's the best there ever was. And so through this small world sort of vector, I mean, I had already reached out to Matt Taibbi, but Taibbi wasn't responding. And, I was working, hammering, quite frankly, Will Dana at that time. And I remember Dana, at first I thought he was like being a gatekeeper and like, keeping me off at bay and everything else. But after a while, it started to kind of add up what Dana was telling me. And he was saying things like, look, Matt just likes to operate on his own. He's really not that interested in, collaborations or doing things as a subject, so to speak. He does his work. And if people want to base, what they're doing off of his stuff as second source, I'll be, that's great. Maybe he'll, make an appearance as like an interviewee, a journalist, an expert on the subject, that sort of thing. And I couldn't really ever knock Matt down. I remember dealing with his assistant. It took forever. I finally got through to him once, had a conversation, tried to lay out a pitch to him. And he's like, yeah, I got a lot of things going on. And I could only imagine at that time, he must have had unbelievable amounts of things going on. I mean, he was a frequent guest, and he still is, on Bill Maher and other things. And he was also, like the chief guy at Rolling Stone magazine. And, he had already kind of inherited, I guess you could say, the previous generation of Rolling Stone readers who had fallen in love with Hunter Thompson and gonzo journalism. And here Matt Taibbi was doing his shtick, right? And it was epic. It was unbelievably epic. But because I couldn't land Taibbi to be the face of our program, I ended up having to do it. And then ultimately, as a result of that, I ended up having to be our basically go-to researcher, which means I had to put everything together based on a lot of what Taibbi was writing and many, many others and everything else. And it put me into a position eventually where I met a gentleman by the name of William K. Black. And I've said how I met Bill Black on many occasions. But, once I met Bill Black, it was next level. And as we moved forward in our production of the con, I started to learn about halfway through it, oh, wait a second, there's even more information that Taibbi's reported on. And so I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to pick up the mantle and I'm going to have to move forward. Okay, fine, great, whatever. I was very, very fortunate. I got a chance to be the protagonist in a project that I had, wanted to create. And, we went all the way through and we got it done. And to this day, and it will be until millions of you come to the fore and understand what we're talking about, that it's the revelation of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that was actually censored. And not only was it censored by the Borg, and what I refer to as the Borg is really the way you're seen, in a monumental way as a documentary filmmaker these days, unlike, let's say in the 80s and the 90s, if you happen to make a name for yourself in independent cinema and you started to grow an audience yourself, you could get on to the next thing and the next thing, and then you could maybe, like Michael Moore, have dramatic impact. I mean, that was kind of the pathway in those days. But since we've had the monopolies of these techno platform empires, Netflix, now HBO, which is Max, and all of the rest, there is a methodology to the way the algorithms work on those particular platforms, and those platforms are monstrous. They require amazing investment into content to create as much content as the consumer can absorb, and the competition is, well, look, if we offer all of the different array of content, like networks and what was cable television and what was live television and all of those things that we've been consuming as Americans in media forever, if they could put that under one umbrella, according to Reed Hastings of Netflix, or what we've seen of HBO Max, especially recently, because it's now all of the Time Warner companies, because they merged with Discovery Networks not long ago, last summer, as a matter of fact, and now it's all Max. And so, you get one platform, you spend $15, $17 a month, and if you want, to get a documentary, well, they're all competing and they're all showcasing important documentaries and a lot of great work. But at the same time, our work reveals who controls the world. And it's not the Jews. Even though there's a lot of Jews in this business, it's the financial sector. And the financial sector is Wall Street. And it's this, hierarchy based on the too big to fail banks like JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo and Bank of America and now Goldman Sachs and a whole consortium of others, but also that include private equity companies and asset managers and hedge funds. And there's probably a number of different sorts of financial schemes that I'm not aware of, quite frankly. But those are pretty much the primary ones in the big companies. And so these huge platforms, these mega platforms, there's probably one company that kind of is outside of the sort of purview of Wall Street, and that's Apple. Apple has so much in sales and so much in, its own cash that it could probably do whatever it wants, but it probably debt finances because it's just cheaper that way and they can have higher profits and that sort of thing. So what my discovery has been in terms of censorship is that because we explore and expose in the con and name names, and we show you the how, who did what, when, and how, who covered it up, to the tune of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that buried over 50 million Americans, destroyed over 100 million people worldwide, and led to tens of trillions of dollars, hundreds of trillions of dollars around the world of damage, and then tens of trillions of dollars of stimulus and emergency lending apparatuses by the Federal Reserve that were used illegally to guarantee all the fraud, from the full faith and credit of the United States to the lender of resort last capacity of Federal Reserve Act 13.3, none of which the statutes enable you to loan the full faith and credit of the United States for a racketeering empire that went bankrupt based on its own its own fraud that ultimately was insolvent. I mean, it's so ridiculous that I've got to bring this information to you because nobody else will. But that brings us to the first leg of the sort of the rhetorical stool in this particular Twitter Spaces tonight, which is censorship. So yesterday, Robert Kennedy Jr. and others are on the floor of the House, and Robert Kennedy Jr. is, talking about censorship and how he's being censored and, his position on it and everything else. Now, on a personal level, I've been paying attention to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. since let's call him Bobby Kennedy, since he announced his presidency. At first, I was very intrigued. Then I got a little bit concerned. Then I kind of got a little bit perturbed. And then I got a little bit like, okay, well, I got to do a little deep dive, understand him more, understand what he's all about, and or at least to the best of my ability. In between everything else I'm trying to do, like everybody else, and I'm trying to do my due diligence. And and I'm doing it by listening to what he's saying for the most part, right? And so as he comes out of the gate when he announces his presidency, he starts talking about the CIA. And I've got an incredible interest in the CIA and a lot of things that intersect with my story and what it's all about. But of course, and I got to say this up at the top. So when I did some of my interviews in Manhattan, and we went to Manhattan a number of times, but I was dealing and working with some prolific journalists, one of which, and in the con, by the way, we deal with some of the top journalists of all time. So our credibility is really something in consideration of what I'm about to say. But one of the guys that I went to is a guy by the name of William Cohen. And he writes for the New York Times, he writes for the New Yorker, he writes for the Atlantic, he writes for Vanity Fair and others. And he's a well-known guy. He's written a number of books, and he actually came out of the banking industry, and he's done a lot of stuff. And he's written some prolific books. Now, I never read most of his books until I had to do research for the con, but I'll never forget finally getting in touch with Cohen. And some people who are listening to this and who understand the story, they might be like, well, wait a second, you're dealing with one of the top, financial journalists of Wall Street. Doesn't he have conflict of interest? Well, at this time period, he didn't, and he was telling the truth at this time period. And that was amazing, and it was interesting at the same time because there was a lot of like personal small world scenarios, not too dissimilar, by the way, to what I mentioned about my investor, my partner, being a schoolmate of Matt Taibbi's boss. in this case. I could go on and on with like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon sort of situation, but in this particular case, Cohen agrees to be interviewed, and I read his book House of Cards, and I read his book Power and Money. First one was about the run on Bear Stearns. The second one was about Goldman Sachs, and he's like James Michener, and he writes these 1,600 page, 2,000 page, hugely cited, incredibly professional, skillfully set, stories and analysis and novels on what these companies are and their background and what they did and everything else. And he gives you the good and the bad, maybe more than you really need, but he gives you the entire context. And then sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what the point is when you read that much. But the bottom line is, typically he knows a lot about a lot of things. And so I end up interviewing him, and we interviewed him in Little Italy. It was one of the most peculiar days of my life. I was set to interview the economist Michael Hudson prior to this interview, and Michael Hudson is just the opposite of William Cohen. But okay, that is kind of the strange universe I was rolling in. But we ended up interviewing William D. Cohen in Little Italy, and then I remember going to get a coffee with him, and it was really interesting because of all the information we got from him. But also I remember talking to him, and I as a young filmmaker coming up, one of my inspirations was Oliver Stone and all things Oliver Stone. And one of my most impactful films for me was, JFK. And we got to talking about Oliver Stone because, as it turns out, Oliver Stone lifted a lot of what he was aiming for in Wall Street Money Never Sleeps, which is the second Wall Street film that followed the 2008 great financial crisis, based on William Cohen's book, House of Cards. But ironically, Oliver Stone rushed it, really didn't understand what he was dealing with, and got it completely wrong. And I was really kind of having a good laugh about that, listening to that story from the source, William D. Cohen. But I'll never forget hailing a cab and putting him in a cab. And as he's getting in the cab, he says to me, and he looks over his shoulder, "The day it all changed was the day Kennedy was assassinated." And I was like, okay, what did he just say? I mean, I'm talking to him about details of Wall Street corruption, and he says that at the end of our time period together. And I was like, why did he just tell me that? And so when Bobby Kennedy announced his presidency, and he started talking about the CIA and, all of its, horrific realities as it relates to the assassination of JFK, and what he was revealing, I found incredibly fascinating, and I wanted to hear it. And I thought, okay, here's a guy that wants to shake things up because he, announced immediately, he wants to run a campaign on truth, and that the real battle is the war against the middle class, based on this incredible stranglehold that corporations have on America, all of which resonate with me. And so I was listening to that, and I was like, oh man, this is going to be really fascinating, especially because, as it turns out, his campaign manager is really close to me. So there's three. Let's count them, okay? So the first connectivity is Matt Taibbi's boss became a very good, close, personal friend of mine, Will Dana. In the case of where did I go after that? Because I was talking about William D. Cohen. Oh yeah, I talked about a lot, but then ultimately William D. Cohen, because of his connection with people that also knew the guy that was my partner and knew them very well, and that's probably why he decided to be involved. And by the way, he happened to write a story, and he probably thought, now that I think about this out loud, he probably thought this is why I had reached out to him to try to be in our work that was actually being invested in by this particular person, because Bill Cohen actually wrote the Vanity Fair piece on none other than NXIVM, which involved my partner's half-sister and his father. Okay, so once again, small world number two. Now, small world number three in this particular case is, Bobby Kennedy, because his campaign chairman is somebody I've been dealing with for the last year and a half. In fact, I did a podcast last year, about a year and a half ago, we called the New Untouchables that you can find on Google. And it's with the Real Progressives. And if you go to the second to the last episode, it's right there, Dennis Kucinich. And I've been in contact with Dennis Kucinich ever since. In fact, Dennis was going to run for president, and he was definitely interested in our services because of what we do. And then he ended up becoming the campaign manager of Bobby Kennedy. And so here's Bobby Kennedy laying out all of these things about, we're going to tackle corruption. We're going to tell the truth. We're going to have, this incredible, campaign to ultimately deal with all of these ginormous problems, of which, of course, that's where I'm coming from, because we put together the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that fell on deaf ears, disappeared because we got thwarted by the machine, and then ultimately we got thwarted by too much noise and people's capacity to be able to comprehend what's what. I mean, all of those are like 3 strikes, you're out, man. And so that's why I'm doing these truth bombs, and I'm doing these Twitter Spaces lives that have reached over 10,000 people in the last week. And so the only way I'm going to get this information to the throngs and the millions of people that need to hear it is by constantly bringing you this information to hopefully something triggers so that you can see the big picture. But going back to Bobby Kennedy. So last night, Lawrence O'Donnell, well, 2 things. The first is that he was testifying in Congress based on censorship. And I listened to quite a bit of it, and it's kind of tied into Matt Taibbi and the Twitter files and things that, are happening, particularly that are being espoused by the right because, they're like this deep state in this whole scenario, which I find a lot of truth to, particularly in the Twitter files. I mean, it's pretty self-evident, and Matt Taibbi does really fantastic work. It's pretty bulletproof. The only thing that was questionable was, it seemed like Elon Musk put him in the catbird seat. And I can tell you that from where I'm sitting, ever since Elon Musk took over Twitter, minus Twitter Spaces, I think that Elon Musk has really destroyed Twitter. And I can tell you there's some weird things going on my feeds. I'm not sure if you've experienced the same thing, but the more sort of noise I make, the more attention I get, the more beautiful female, basically pole dancing hookers wind up on my feed and private messaging me. And I'm like, you guys aren't really the audience I'm looking for. And then I'm pretty sure they're not real, but that's besides the point. So Bobby Kennedy, does this whole thing, the censorship thing's going the whole thing. But, I've heard Bobby Kennedy, basically put an emphasis on things like, Hunter Biden's laptop. And that, millions of people probably would have voted for Trump had it not been for, the deep state suppressing the information on Hunter Biden's laptop and everything that constitutes. And I always thought, that's bullshit. And, I didn't buy it. And I had a little bit of a problem with it. And then I ended up having a little bit of a problem with things. I started to learn more and more about vaccines and, what he knows and what he doesn't know. I'm not an expert in vaccines. Certainly got a lot of questions about COVID, but not so much the epidemic and pandemic itself, even though a lot of that's coming down the pike now, going back to Matt Taibbi and the Wuhan lab and what he and Russell Brand are involved with. And I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of, censorship and in terms of Hunter Biden's laptop and emphasis and cherry picking and Bobby Kennedy and then vaccines and virus and then who's telling the truth and who's going to upswell, some sort of decency to where we talk to each other and we can all engage each other and we don't have to hate each other and be so polarized. And that's what Bobby Kennedy's saying, on top of the stuff that I said at the outset that I found interesting, like, the fact that he's going to call a spade on the CIA. And there's so much more to reveal about the CIA. But if you start with the revelations of what's going on with the Kennedy assassination, boy, the whole last 7 years kind of turns upside down, doesn't it? But anybody who knows about the CIA, there's plenty of things to go on just with the information that's public now. But so Lawrence O'Donnell last night, and Lawrence O'Donnell is this guy on MSNBC who I actually have a great deal of respect for. I've always thought he was kind of second fiddle to Rachel Maddow, and I always had my beef with MSNBC with Rachel Maddow because for the past, let's call it 11 years, particularly during the Trump presidency, Rachel Maddow was all about Trump with deep dive, all sorts of cross-pollinating stories of hyper sort of racketeering as it relates to fraud and corruption. Okay, I'm like, wait a second. Here's this woman who has all of these resources, who obviously has the dexterity, the capacity, the right sort of methodology and the framing and all of those things that are on display in everything that she does, except of course, she doesn't touch Wall Street, and she doesn't touch, except for to prop them up as heroes, former President Barack Obama, and of course our former Attorney General, who's frequently a guest on Rachel's Maddow show and has been for years and years and years. Eric Holder. Sorry about that. And so for years and years, while I'm, pursuing and making and investigating and finding out all of the information of everything that created the 2008 great financial crisis and the cover-up that followed, that led us onto this remarkable revelation that, here is this, extremely high-paid, high-placed woman with a lot of instinct and, just resources, quite frankly. And then, of course, she has, the ability to do it, was never asking the right questions about that story. And so I just kind of put it down after years and years of kind of ultimately get to the point of really just not believing anything about Rachel Maddow outside of whatever she says on Trump, because I buy all of that. But the rest of it, it's just like she became, in my opinion, the director of communications for the Wall Street meritocratous Democratic Party. And then this last year, she got paid $30 million. She got a $30 million raise, and so she always, overshadowed Lawrence O'Donnell. But I always liked Lawrence O'Donnell. I thought Lawrence O'Donnell did great work, especially of his takedown on Trump. But again, just like Rachel Maddow, he never went close to Wall Street. But I just kind of gave him a write-off because he was secondary to Rachel Maddow and everything else. And plus, I ended up liking his work with Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard professor that was the instructor for Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, among others, and who, every time I've listened to Lawrence Tribe, I'm absolutely blown away at his absolute genius at uncovering what we need to know as a public in very simple terms about what's happening in all of these cases. But Lawrence O'Donnell does this unbelievable takedown of Bobby Kennedy last night. I mean, I'd call it vicious, but it might have all been appropriate. Some of the things I had some question marks in my mind, boy, he certainly exploited them. The stuff about vaccine and whether or not Bobby Kennedy, really is an authority to be able to talk about some of the stuff that he is. He basically obliterated that. And he obliterated his credibility in everything. Bobby Kennedy's credibility in everything. He obliterated who he is as a person. He was a former drug addict. He always got handed everything, and he had, many problems in his personal life, and, he's not the expert that he says he is. Meanwhile, like a lot of the stuff that Kennedy have said throughout the years and what I've heard as it relates to the environment and it relates to other things, I've, for the most part, appreciated and liked, I guess. Once we got into, I used to think a lot of stuff that I've heard Bobby Kennedy say in the last couple of weeks as it relates to full-on capitalism in the marketplace, as it relates to environmentalism. Yeah, I used to think of capitalism with a conscience in the early 90s, and that's before I learned the information that I now know like the back of my hand, which is complete corporate fascism that has absolute control over everything. And my takeaway, as I call it, people are saying in mainstream, especially on MSNBC, oh, this is our last chance to protect democracy. Fuck that. Democracy got destroyed, a long time ago, long before the collapse of 2008. But the 2008 great financial crisis was a nail in the coffin of democracy. And we are a corporate fascist state. And I don't mean that to be redundant, but I do that to emphasize what we are, because it has complete control and it definitely skews right. And but it's authoritarianism. And then but it's undergirded by a criminal syndicate, which is our financial system, which has become the mob. And that's what we demonstrate in The Con at www.thecon.tv, now for free, the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history. That is, the story that everybody has censored. So, Lawrence O'Donnell, in this absolute magnificent, if you're on his side, takedown of Bobby Kennedy and his credibility, just decimated Kennedy, particularly as it related to, Kennedy's, I guess, shadow anti-Semitism, if that's what it is. I'm not even sure if that's what it is. A couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, I heard what he had to say about the vaccine and him saying that it's targeted more towards, white people, I guess. Did he say Anglo-Saxon people? He definitely said white people and black people, which I thought was an interesting hybrid of who would be targeted. But he said that the ones that were spared were Chinese and Ashkenazi Jews. I thought that was strange, but from what I heard from his, his sort of extrapolation was he was reading data that he believed. And I don't know if that's anti-Semitism. I have no idea. I'm just listening to a guy that I think basically is acting like that's the data that he believes. And again, I do know, and I've heard that, Bobby Kennedy's central sort of primer on everything is that the evil empire isn't Wall Street necessarily, even though he definitely talks about him out of the side of his mouth every once in a while. But the evil empire to him is, big pharma. And he's so anti-vax and he's anti-Fauci and he's anti, COVID and the mandates and everything else. And that's where this whole, Michigas as it relates to anti-Semitism and, what this brutal takedown from Lawrence O'Donnell was. And, if I was just watching Lawrence O'Donnell straight, not knowing what I know, I would have been, stick a fork in Bobby and that's it, right? Now, I'm not here to make a case whether or not Bobby is, a viable candidate or anything like that. My point, though, is that knowing what I know, that MSNBC has not brought to the fore, either through Lawrence O'Donnell or most especially Rachel Maddow, and knowing what I have and what we've demonstrated and what I have on my shelf, 300 plus hours of information and tens of thousands of documents, and I've got the entire story of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that destroyed the middle class. It was like more like the nail in the coffin because 40 years of neoliberalism destroyed the middle class of this country and outsourcing and offshoring and everything that constitutes what our financial system has become, which I've just described. I would be if I didn't have the knowledge that I did, I would be like, oh my God, Bobby Kennedy's the Antichrist. But knowing what I know, and I still have respect for Lawrence O'Donnell. Please don't conflate this with I think Lawrence O'Donnell's a complete idiot, because he's not. He's a very smart guy, maybe too smart. But the bottom line is he's if you think about it from what I just said and how he did it and how he rolled out it, being as robust and as aggressive as he was, it was almost like the powers that be were like, okay, because Maddow's not in her position, let's unleash Lawrence to be the bulldog because he's from Massachusetts and apparently he sat next to Kennedy in law school and knew kind of who Kennedy was as a drug addict and kind of a failure student and all that kind of stuff, which may have given it even more gravity. But, to me, it kind of felt like, all right, is O'Donnell MSNBC's version of Sean Hannity for Trump? You know what I mean? It's like, I didn't want to think that, but I kind of thought that. I'll leave it up to you to interpret it your way, but I will say that I did make that comment on Twitter last night and I got attacked. Like people thinking like, what, I'm a full champion of Bobby Kennedy? I'm not even remotely. And I'm still trying to decipher a lot of things that Kennedy's in the mix. And I'm one step away from Kennedy, as I had said at the outset of this thing, vis-a-vis Dennis Kucinich, who's Bobby Kennedy's campaign manager. And while Bobby Kennedy is saying that he's going to run a campaign of truth and he's going to, try to uncorrupt the corrupted corporate space, and then he wants to have, full-on free market as it relates to solving our energy problems and that sort of thing, much of which, albeit honestly, is an impossibility until you break up corruption first and foremost. And I'll pull back to that in a minute. But the long and the short of it is, if you can make this analogy, any longer or shorter, is the reality that you cannot put all your faith into one narrative. You got to do your own homework a lot of the times, right? But that's what I had to do because the world that followed the 2008 great financial crisis had absolutely no bearing on the reality that I was living. So therefore, as a producer, I had to go out and find the story, which miraculously I did. And there's even more miracles than me having such close proximity to, for example, everybody I'm talking about in this piece, from Matt Taibbi to Oliver Stone to Dennis Kucinich and Bobby Kennedy, and there's more to come. But the long and the short of it is that in our work, we had to go the distance to get it right, where we got the good guys from the FBI and the DOJ and the SEC that are professionals in this sense, that came from decades of being in the business, that told us exactly how this whole thing went down. And then we got the evidence and everything else, to the tune where we had to, cross our T's and dot our I's to be able to pass the muster so we wouldn't get sued by the most powerful corporate attorneys on the planet that represent Wall Street. Otherwise, we'd be sued into oblivion. But instead, what they did was they censored us. And they made sure that we didn't get on one of these major platforms that they fund because, okay, would we be able to continue business as normal if everybody knew what happened and how the system works? I guess not. I do know there were alternatives to what happened. I know that in the aftermath of 2008, the Federal Reserve said, and everybody on Wall Street said, look, Tina, there is no alternative. Oh yeah, there was an alternative. Put all of the criminal racketeer CEOs in prison for their crimes, pull back all the money they made, nationalize the banks, and then clean them all up, get everything back to square, get rid of all of the massive betrayal of the deceptive thievery in the courts, and then ultimately make everybody whole, and then sell the banks back to people that were going to, be honest purveyors of what our system should be if we had the integrity of law and the system worked. But we didn't have a, platform of journalism explaining all of this to you, and nor did we have a government of, by, and for the people that actually did its job to where all of the information that we put out there in the con, which is to reveal the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, that's on top of all of the other racketeering enterprises in history that include fossil fuel matrix and all sorts of other things like money laundering and you name it on a global scale. But, here we are with Bobby Kennedy saying he's going to wage a truth campaign, but without telling you this information, even though I'm one step away from him. Okay, so that's odd. And then, of course, Matt Taibbi being the guy that came from this background, but yet where is he? And then who is Russell Brand? Russell Brand, a guy that's got, 6 million followers, 6.4 million followers that he likes to point out on YouTube, and he's trying to create this great awakening, and he's trying to be this truth sayer. What Russell Brand has showed his cards to be, just like I think I'm seeing more and more of Bobby Kennedy, but definitely Matt Taibbi and others, Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore and all of these other guys. Most of these guys are following the lead of Tucker Carlson first and foremost, which is extremely problematic and extremely, it just kills my soul because I really like Russell Brand and Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore, at least on some level. Jimmy Dore not so much, but the rest, yeah. But they've all gone this way. They made a decision to cherry pick what the Democrats are involved with to basically make their positions on the war between Russia and Ukraine. And, as if, by the way, Trump is some sort of peace activist. I do want to make this point briefly. For those of you who listen to this and are like, yeah, all of these guys, literally, they don't want war. Because I've seen a lot of peaceniks, a lot of people that are anti-war that are like skewed towards this sort of Bobby Kennedy. And then, like we see Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and some of these other guys, right? And they're all like, the whole thing was a provocation by NATO. And yeah, Putin might be a bad guy, but, we got to get out. We got to stop the war machine and the war's all these problems. And it's become their centerpiece. And then that somehow evolves into Trump is anti-war. Trump is an anti-war. Trump is an opportunist who will take money anywhere he can get it. Case in point, during his entire presidency, who was he, making sure that we could, sell arms to at a rate that we've never done before in the history of the world? Saudi Arabia. Was Saudi Arabia involved with a war with Yemen, murdering and starving, among others, children in Yemen? Oh, yeah. So did Trump have a problem with that? Oh, no. Not to mention, we know that the 15 of the 19 hijackers of 9/11 were Saudi. We know that those hijackers were given material assistance financially for all sorts of things that happened pre-9/11 that were coming directly from Bandar bin Sultan's wife. And this all somehow was able to slip through the largest, intelligence deep state in the history of the world, right? Yeah, good luck with that. I don't want to talk about 9/11. That's not the point of this, but it's like censorship, whose agendas are they? What are they doing? Who's who in this whole confangled mess? What is Russell Brand all about? Russell Brand cherry picks all this stuff. He wants to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. He wants to talk about the Freedom Caucus. He wants to talk about the stuff that I see on Twitter where Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene are talking about. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene was pulling out nude photos of Hunter Biden and all sorts of just like really ridiculous behavior. And yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of corruption to talk about as it relates to Burisma and Biden and other things. The real corruption with Biden has been 4 decades of Delaware and LLCs and insurance and credit cards. Okay, I mean, and probably the prison industrial complex, way beyond anything that we're talking about with Hunter Biden. But yet, all of these people are fixated on the censorship of the Twitter files and what they're hiding in terms of Hunter Biden, which, in my revelation of corruption, is literally a flea on the back of a gnat, on the back of an ant, on the back of an elephant, if that, maybe the back of a blue whale. Let's put it that way, because the con reveals a incredibly engineered, architected pipeline of fraud that was led by the CEOs of Wall Street in the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that would go on to blow up at least 50 million Americans, maybe 100 million plus people around the world because of the derivatives blow up, hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of trillion or hundreds of trillions of dollars, and then tens of trillions of dollars to the guys that blew up the world in the aftermath, all of which was illegal. And so when you think about censorship, you think about Bobby Kennedy, you think about Lawrence O'Donnell, and ultimately Russell Brand, and what they're all talking about. What are they not talking about? I'll give you a hint. It's what I've spent the last, let's take a look. It looks like an hour, and that's what I wanted to record for tonight. The last hour talking about. So look, I'm going directly to the people, because in the end, I'm the only one who can do it. I've worked with all of these experts, way smarter than I am, way more knowledgeable than I am. I don't walk on water. I didn't part the Red Sea. I'm just a guy who is the guy who gathered all the information. And so I've become this Pied Piper because I'm up against this incredible Borg of disinformation from media that lies to us 24/7, that manipulates and disassociates, and then, turns it all into this pretzel logic about he said, she said, and everybody's pointing in the wrong direction. Everybody's working for the algorithms or, whatever their nightly Nielsen rating is, and they're all working for the system that's paying for them. Meanwhile, I'm not working for any of those tycoons. I'm not even working for the very wealthy individual who funded my program, which I shouldn't say there's a huge team behind it, but I'm the one who's definitely championing it, because all of my team's given up. They're like, wait a second, this is never going to penetrate. The people don't want to know the truth because everybody buys lies. In America, we do. And I know there's millions of you who don't want to, but you don't know what the alternative is, which is what I'm bringing to you. So look, all you have to do is go to www.thecon.tv. It's free. You don't even have to pay anything to see it. It's free. Please share it like your life depends on it once you understand the facts and the evidence and the truth, because then once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you will understand how this whole system works. Because whether we're talking about student loans, whether we're talking about all sorts of manner of shape or form of debt financing and securitization and derivatives and everything else, they're all tied to the same construct, which ultimately flows from the central bank of the United States. And the whole world is in on it because everybody's laundering money into our financial system that's backstopped because of what I just laid out. And I can assure you there's more involved, especially with fossil fuel and energy around the world, and whoever's getting their hands greased, man. And of course, a lot of people want to talk about sex trafficking in that mix, and I'll kind of close with this just to kind of put not too much of a exclamation on point on it, but it's amazing. So you've got all these MAGAs that are reacting to everything that we've talked about and then some, and most of them are, if you've seen all over social media, just outraged by sex trafficking, and they use it as the new blood libel to basically peg, this sort of, secretive cabal of Democrats, I suppose, that are hiding this and are involved, and it always comes back to Epstein, right? But meanwhile, as we've learned this last week, Chase, the largest bank in the United States that's involved with everything I've told you so far, and their CEO, Jamie Dimon, is probably at the apex of everything I've said, especially everything that we show you in the con, as it relates to what we call control fraud, and by the way, so much more. But Chase, agreed to a $290 million settlement with the victims of Epstein Island, okay? They were doing business with Epstein. They had a hedge fund division that were involved. They were involved with being able to finance all the stuff that was going on, which was probably leveraging people that were in power, with sex blackmail, so that they could, control scientists and politicians and rich people. And they were very successful at it, which obviously also intersects, interestingly enough, with Trump, because it was revealed this last week a lot of the masseuses were coming out of Mar-a-Lago. Okay, and I could go on and on and on and on. But look, the bottom line is that I have hundreds of hours on the shelf that reveals more documentation fraud that you could possibly ever imagine. We know that there's tens of millions of documentation fraud. In the case, I have one associate and source that literally had in his possession the evidence of Bank of America destroying 2 billion pieces of data from this era that led to illegal foreclosures, where millions upon millions of people were foreclosed upon illegally. Don't get caught up in who they were and what they were all about and everything else. It was the machine through the securitization process and the liar's loans and the documentation fraud that led to corrupt courts, where we had attorneys lying in court and we have judges lying in court, just like we're seeing from Lawrence O'Donnell and Lawrence Tribe talk about Judge Cannon and the criminal fraud exception that proves that, attorneys lie in court and, a judge can be compromised. And then on top of that, of course, we know that the Supreme Court is filled to the brim with corruption, as we've seen with Judge Alito and Judge Clarence Thomas and more to come, right? So I'll close with this. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the 10,000 views for the previous stuff that we've done. I'm going to bring in more people as these move forward. Hopefully you can catch it live. I'm just doing these things impromptu at the moment when I can, but we'll schedule. I've got some huge guests coming down the pike, some very exciting things. But I will tell you that what I'm attempting to do, guys, because we've seen, in media, for example, they make billions of dollars from lying. The government makes billions of dollars to lie for corporations and multinationals and individuals that spend billions to corrupt our system to loot trillions. I've got all the evidence, man. I know how to take this system down. I am the freaking, the cannonball that can train wreck corruption and the fascism that it fuels if I can get millions of you to join me. And we've already put $4.5 million into this project. And what I'm asking you to consider, since we've made the project free, and because nobody else is going to bring you this information, not Bobby Kennedy, sure as shit not Cornel West. I love Cornel West, but as much as Cornel West talks about systemic racism, he doesn't even have the first inclination of what creates predatory loans and how this whole thing works. And I've tried to get him the information for quite a while, and I've talked to him twice, and he's like, yeah. It's kind of like if you don't, come from his, hierarchy of academia, he's not going to talk to you. It's ridiculous. Marianne Williamson, I don't know where she is right now. She started talking pretty interesting things on TikTok, and hopefully one day she will be, bringing some of this information to the people and that sort of thing. But look, anybody on the Republican side, I mean, Ron DeSantis is saying that slavery provided good characteristics for slaves so that they benefited from it, right? I mean, that's among other ridiculous, insane things. And by the way, Ron DeSantis handpicked all of the Supreme Court justices with his general counsel who was involved with this case that I'm involved with down in South Florida, where they handpicked all of these judges to make sure that the banks could illegally foreclose on millions upon millions of people. The corruption is absolutely insane. And that's what I'm trying to obliterate. And so if you find interest in all of this information and you're turned and suddenly the light bulb goes on and you're like, oh my God, what have I been missing this whole time? Nobody's going to get to the bottom of this. Nobody's going to fix this problem except this dude I just caught on, of all things, Twitter Spaces, who made this incredible investigative series that nobody ever heard about it until it started to grow like wildfire, organically, which is called The Con at www.thecon.tv. And so what I would encourage you to consider is to invest $13 into this populist tidal wave crusade to purge corruption. Because if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who champions dignity and decency and beauty and integrity and above all sustainability, if we merge in unity, we will purge the misery of tyranny. And ultimately that's who I am and that's what I'm all about. And look, if you don't have skin in the game, you're the product. And there's going to be, so many people coming at you for your money, whether it's Bernie Sanders to say we got to have a campaign to, fix the environment, or, raise money for Biden. Who's Biden getting paid for by, right? The system that gave us the problem of what Bernie is saying we got to fix now on the climate problem. You can't fix any of these problems without purging corruption. Same with everybody, in the primaries, whether it's, Bobby Kennedy, who's not going to talk about this stuff unless millions of us rise to the occasion. And then same with, Cornel West, and same with Marianne Williamson, and same with Biden, and of course Trump. And the whole thing comes down to racketeering. And Trump is going to get nailed for racketeering by Fani Willis down in Georgia for, everything he's doing in the insurrection and trying to steal the election. And he learned all of this stuff from what happened in the great financial crisis, which we proved the only RICO conviction in the country. We found the only RICO conviction in the country that should have taken down the entire panoply of Wall Street. And how do I know? The director of the FBI, who told me, who tried to pull a dragnet to end this mortgage fraud situation, realized later that it was Wall Street, and it was all racketeering, and they're all dons, just like the head of these criminal families, which is why we created RICO to begin with. My friends, thank you for listening. Please like and share and subscribe. And above all else, please invest $13 in a tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt. Onwards, my friends, and upwards. Thank you for listening. All the best.